Next up is Ian Goodwin. Ian is the owner and founder of the Parking Consultancy and has worked in parking and sustainable travel planning for over 25 years, including transport manager roles at Manchester Met University and Central Manchester NHS Trust. Ian chairs the Higher Education Special Interest Group for the British Parking Association, and he joins ZC3 today to present on effective permit management. Ian, over to you.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. My presentation is around effective permit management, the gateway to sustainable transport planning. Just to give you an idea of the contents of the presentation. Firstly, I've been introduced, but I might just add to that. Just next slide, please. Then I'll do a case study around effective permit management and how that was a critical part of demand management and sustainable travel planning during my time at Central Manchester NHS Trust. That's really sort of reminiscing back to the start of my career, but I feel the project and my role there is still very relevant to the topics of conversation today. I'll then have a slide on the need for annual renewals and needs-based assessment, how permit management and charging methodologies can support sustainable travel options, and then some key takeaways. Next slide, please. So most of the introductions have been done. Just touching on, I suppose, specialists as demand management. I've worked in a number of organisations that are either undergoing major site redevelopments or site consolidations, which really needed the development, I'd like to call it an accessibility strategy, to really bring in the parking elements together with sustainable transport. Next slide, please. So some background to Central Manchester NHS Foundation Trust. It was formed on the 1st of April 2001. So going back, as I say, to around about 20 years ago at the start of my career. It was and still is one of the largest teaching trusts in the country. And at that time, it employed around 8,000 staff across 3 main sites. Again, the trust's grown substantially, joining with a number of other trusts. So that staff figure is probably approaching about 20,000 staff now. Back in July 2004, we saw the start of a major PFI, Private Finance Initiative scheme, to transfer all services onto a single site, which meant the complete redevelopment of most of the Central Trust site. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of background about the Trust, it's roughly about 1.5 miles south of the city, and it's situated next to 3 major universities and the Royal Northern College of Music. It's adjacent to some of the most deprived wards in Greater Manchester, and as a city centre location has associated parking problems and landlocked sites. At that time, there was no direct bus service from the north of the city, with people travelling from the north having to interchange in the centre, usually changing operators and having to purchase a different ticket type. There was also a missing link to Piccadilly railway station with no direct bus service, and we were also not linked to the Metrolink line. And the corridor was part of the higher education precinct, as it was known. Next slide, please. So in 2000, there was a major transport study carried out jointly with the 4 major organisations on the corridor. And one of the main recommendations was to employ a travel coordinator, which I was successful in gaining that role. The main aim was to develop a travel plan collectively, using the size and scale of the organisation to lobby for major transport improvements on the corridor, and to fund some of those also, but also to look site specifically at the individual sites and develop individual travel plans. Next slide, please. So at the end of the Private Finance Initiative scheme in 2009, there was large increased forecasting, staff on site, outpatients and consultancy episodes. The higher education precincts and the universities were also developing their estates at the time and had associated large increases in predicted student and staff numbers. This really gives a real focus to travel planning on the corridor. Next slide, please. So in terms of the new hospital development and its effect on car parking policy, it's really sort of temporary problem initially for around about 18 months. We lost approximately half the capacity of the trust, that was 1,200 spaces. And this was compounded by the fact we wanted to keep the patient and visitor ratio. So a lot of the effect was on staff parking and commuting. By December 2005, there was the completion of a new multi-storey car park, which would bring car parking capacity back to sort of pre-development levels. Although in a couple of years post that date, there was the relocation of the two large children's hospitals from the north of the city, which again increased population and really meant this was a continual process of reducing and managing single car occupancy. So in terms of solutions, it was a combination of demand management, best use of remaining on-site capacity, creating off-site solutions in terms of park and rides, and implementing the Trust Travel Plan. Next slide, please. So in terms of demand management measures, we introduced permit management. That was a key first step, and needs-based assessment to assess people based on their need, both socially and work-based, to see who would retain a permit on site. We introduced car sharing. We created Manchester's first large-scale park and rides, and also leased some car parks off-site. And we ensured and reviewed parking charges to make sure they were aligned with the cost of public transport to make car travel not an easy and cheap option. And we also significantly invested in the travel plan. Next slide. So in terms of the best use of remaining on-site capacity, we did some research into various trusts that have implemented points-based, needs-based permit management. And we took the example from Huddersfield and Caldervale NHS Trust and mirrored some of their criteria and some of their scoring. This led to quite detailed and in-depth consultation with staff side and senior management to approve the criteria. And then we had to reassess 3,200 staff to allocate the remaining spaces on site. The needs-based criteria was really, as I say, work and social-based factors, but really operationally focused on those that were working shifts or had high clinical need to remain on site. There was no effect on night, shift or weekend parking, and we implemented a continuous review process, including an appeals panel with quite wide representation from around the trust to hear appeals from people who have been rejected parking. We also created a buffer zone with pre-bookable spaces. This allowed people who were parking on park and rides or were using active travel or sustainable travel to bring the car on site when they really needed it for that specific day. And we introduced divisional passes for a similar purpose. Next slide. We created Manchester's first large-scale park and ride. This meant quite in-depth research into probably around about 30 or 40 different sites that were potentially suitable. And we chose a site about 1.5 miles east of the trust at a large leisure complex known as Bellevue. We released a number of spaces from Showcase Cinema, Greyhound Stadium and the Gala Bingo, and created a high-frequency quality park and ride bus service using a local operator. The service ran on a 10-minute frequency in the peaks and 15 minutes off peak. And we ensured, the supporting infrastructure was there to keep staff safe and encouraging them to use the park and ride in terms of CCTV coverage. We had security personnel on site and also waiting facilities when there was bad weather, which was subsequently converted into cycle storage compounds at the trust. We also negotiated a lease on 100 spaces at the Sainsbury's Superstore in Fallowfield, about 2 miles south of the site, and we provided staff with a free bus pass on the high-quality frequency bus corridor. And we also procured 288 spaces at a multi-storey car park opposite the St Mary's Hospital. Next slide, please. So now touching on the implementation of the travel plan split into various sections of cycling, walking, public transport, car sharing, marketing and promotional events. Next slide. So we did a lot of work around cycling and walking. We created a bicycle user group and a cycle steering group, and they were instrumental really on identifying where infrastructure and facilities improvements needed to be made. They were also the voice for the cycling and walking community. This led to quite wide scale infrastructure improvements in terms of cycle storage and shower and changing facilities. We worked with the University of Manchester and a master's student to work with this bicycle users group to basically map all of the journeys into site and produce that into an easy to use resource and map for people who are new to cycling. We created discounts with local bike shops and introduced an interest-free loans before the time of cycle to work schemes to allow people to purchase a cycle and equipment, and back that up with cycle training and a cycle hire scheme. Next slide. We made the, bringing in these new facilities a real promotional piece. To the left, you'll see me in my younger days, next to the trust chairman, who was, fundamental in promoting and supporting the travel plan. And to the right was David White, who was the car park operations manager I worked very closely with. Next slide, please. In terms of public transport, we negotiated discounts with all the major operators, and the operator matched the discount provided to the trust. So we offered staff around about 30% reduction on bus travel, and we made a range of tickets available, accessible through the on-site cash office. We supported that with an interest-free loan to allow people to spread the cost of an annual ticket. And one of the larger projects funded by the corridor was the creation of the Oxford Road link, which created that, or solved that missing link between the corridor and Piccadilly Railway Station. It was a high-frequency service Monday to Friday on a 10-minute frequency and a very low 50p fare. We also created bespoke branding for the bus and also route planning information on the side of the bus. We supported local council to submit a bid to central government to create a demand responsive transport network, which served the wards around the trust, the deprived wards. That was a daily service, and again, quite a low fare at £1.50 for a single trip. We supported that with journey planning and information workshops. And a latter project, and another large public transport project, was the Cross City bus package. Next slide, please. So this was really after my time at the trust. I'd left the trust and gone to work for Atkins International in the transport planning. And we re-engaged the GMPTE to put a new bid to central government for a previous bid that had failed with the previous government. We also worked with the trust to design the actual bus interchange facility into the PFI scheme, so buses could actually run into the trust and turn around and go back out again. At my time at Manchester Metropolitan University, I was then on the steering group to ensure the needs and infrastructure for each of the partners was really looked at and adhered to, and that brought buses across Manchester for the first time since deregulation.
Ian, I know you have a couple of extra slides. I do apologise. Yeah. We've run out of time. I believe the slides will be available to people afterwards. There's a lot of detail there, and it just goes to show how much moving parts there are when it comes to kind of thinking about travel plans and sustainability. And obviously they're evolving now with the B network and night buses hooking up to hospitals and stuff. So thank you so much for your inputs today.